coming up in this episode.
It's market risk. And, while commercial will drag a company, and just rightly so in my opinion, is the product ready? That's also a problem which happens where you've got too many sales, you're pushing stuff, and the product readiness just isn't there. And I don't mean selling a roadmap that then needs to be built. That's slightly different. So I think that's the challenge.
Because like you said, the culture is such an important part of it at those early stages that you need to know, okay, yes, they're making a judgment on me if I'm going to be a good fit, but I also need to do the same thing. And I want to see that being a lot more of an accepted thing, actually asking for references in the other direction these days. People
have to recognize that, often that founder is the brand and the make or break of that company regardless. And it's a long time and high risk, in my opinion, to exit a founder out unless there are real, and I've seen that happen too, which I won't go into, but so that's my point, is like you said, founders, be free, trust your gut, use advisors when you need to trust them. I think someone put on LinkedIn, so this is ironic because I'm quoting LinkedIn now, but someone did put, if you want to get nowhere, like, ask everybody. I think make sure you've got the right sort of circle. But you have to make a decision.
The Founders Unplugged podcast, hosted by Greg McCallum. Raw, uncensored conversations with startup founders.
And this weekend, what am I doing this weekend? I am probably going to start doing the old spring, getting the garden sorted stuff.
Nice.
It's probably time. Get the jet wash out. Start doing, getting the furniture clean, all that sort of nonsense. That I do every year.
I'm ahead of you. I already started that. We had like a bit of a moldy patio. That was the exciting highlight of my last weekend, of putting algae and God knows what on the floor and then sweeping that all off. I'm exactly the same as you.
The amount of times I've refilled the pavers in the garden, it's ridiculous. It become the bane of my existence.
I was gonna say our age is showing now. The fact that this is
exciting lives of startup founders. This is what it's all about. Exactly. What about you? Aside from doing something,
I've got my friend coming over this evening, which is good. So I haven't seen her for a while, so I've already got in plenty of prosecco and wine. So pretty much we'll be starting at 5:30. So. She's over, and then my boyfriend's over on Saturday. So chilled on this weekend.
So is it a night in, a girls' night in, or is it a night out?
It's a girls' night in. Well, it's a sad story actually. She's split with her partner, so I'm going to have the down low and hear the whole story. So we're not going out because I think that's a recipe for disaster. We're just going to have a quiet one in, and just I'm going to be the ear listening to what's happened.
Make sure she doesn't text him. You got to take the phone away.
Exactly. Well, we need the phone. We need the phone lockbox. Those boxes you can put. But no, we'll be relatively sensible tonight. So I'll just cook some bits and stay in. Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, it's so great to have you on. I'm really excited to chat to you. So
thanks.
Yeah, and I know we don't have an enormous amount of time.
No, fine.
You're busy, and you've got to get the prosecco sorted on ice and stuff. So
I'm actually interviewing candidates for a client after this. So I will have a hard stop. Yeah.
Fair enough. No worries. Well, let's dive into it then. So like I said to you when we initially spoke, there's not an enormous amount of structure to this thing, but the one bit that I do sort of insist on, if that's okay, is just to ask you to introduce yourself and your business and what you do to those watching and or listening, because I think my guests tend to do it better than I probably could. So why don't you tell us what you do and who you are and such?
Yeah, all good. Well, thanks, Greg, for having me. So my name's Beth. I'm a founder of a company called Developa.io. We are effectively a people and talent consultancy supporting founders in early stage startups. C to Series C is our sweet spot. And there's 3 core services that we do. One, which is pretty obvious, is providing candidates. We do retained searches. The second one, which is more relevant post to Series A raise, is people design projects and strategy there, particularly around performance and reward. And then the third service is coaching, and that's a particular, what I call a centoring program, mix of coaching and mentoring for first-time founders post Series A on that Series A to B journey, where there is a particularly interesting journey for a founder during that time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and we have quite a lot of shared sort of overlap there in terms of, you know, the advisory work and the mentoring work I do, and it's it's rewarding, but it's definitely interesting. So yeah, so tell me, how did you get into well, first of all, how did you what was your journey like? How did you get to where you are at this stage of your career, and then you know, what sort of made you land on Developa?
Yeah, so my depth is talent. So after I did theology at university, so this is, you know, really random. And after that, mostly because I didn't know what I wanted to do at university, but I really loved my religious teacher, and I lived in the middle of nowhere, so seeing different cultures and learning about that, honestly, was as far as it got, was in education. So that was a great experience. And then after that, like most people, I fell into recruitment. And at the time, I thought, I'll do this for a couple of years and then, you know, go and do something else. But I really enjoyed it. I loved it. And the interesting thing about the agency I worked with straight out of university was it specialized in startups and it specialized in tech. So I was working with co-founders from, you know, pretty much a year out of university, guiding them, you know, working across the full development life cycle, and actually having a lot of cultural discussions, which is part of, obviously, very important for any company, but particularly so for early stage startups. So that was a great entry into the world of startups. And after a while there, I eventually transitioned into startups directly. And that was classic, you know, sub 10 people all around a table, the most exciting time I think you can have in a startup, where we were all taking it in turns out of our own pocket to go to Tesco and get each other chocolates, and we were living on Walker's Ready Salted Crisps. My CEO loved them. And you know, that was fantastic. And then after that, I went into a higher growth fintech company, startup as well. That was international by default, and of course regulated. So very different business model to more of the deep tech company I'd been in previously. And then after that, you know, I wasn't going to relocate as part of my role. I was very happy in the UK, but I think everything had led up to this point where I really wanted to support founders on a much broader scale. A portfolio career in a consultancy certainly helps you do that. And that's really where Developa was born. It was always inevitable for me to do that at some point. And I think, you know, more and more people are looking to do that as well now in my industry. And the great thing about it, if I'm very honest, is having the space. I have loads of empathy with operators in the people and talent community, because the irony is, in startups, is very, very innovative, but your biggest constraint is time. And if you've got hiring right, where you're not over hiring, you're actually, you know, at that right tension of what's the word, busy. And you have a lot of work. So the good thing about me coming outside of that now, to be very honest, is I've got a lot more time to be a lot more creative, deeply thinking about. I'm writing a load of mini essays in my free time on high performance right now, but going very, very deep into some of these topics and having a really different perspective of just having the space to rethink things on first principles on the outside now on some of those things, and reflecting on what I would do better. And that's made me a much better advisor and a much better designer, actually, on some of the projects that I'm doing now. So it's been an amazing experience, best decision I ever made. And yeah, I'm loving every part of it.
Yeah, that's an amazing journey. And so what would you say are some of the main, you talked a bit about, you know, the types of companies you're working. So I'm assuming it's primarily those that have maybe just received their first round of funding and then maybe looking to start scale out. That's probably from that point onwards, right? So what are typically some of the main challenges you're seeing from the recruitment side of things at that point specifically?
Yeah, so I categorize them. It's different by founder, of course. I'll be honest,
right,
on the strengths and the founder needs and so forth, and how you actually support them. But there is a bit of a playbook and a recipe of problems that happen at different stages. So I think, you know, at seed stage, it's founder-led recruitment. So the challenge you've got here is coaching the founder on, you know, being really good at baseline recruitment fundamentally, because that's a key part of their role at that stage, and it's make or break trying to find product market fit and so forth. I think then as you get to Series A, the challenge is many things happen at this point. And in my opinion, this is kind of operationally the make or break of that stage of the company. If you can get through that, yes, there are more problems at scale as you go and different problems. But the A to B is the big step change, I think, from, you know, scrappy, one team to functional creation, yada, yada. So at Series A, the types of challenges you've got then is how do we actually start setting up and thinking of scale? And that's when you're thinking a lot more around organizational structure, roles and responsibility, codifying the culture, which I personally think is quite important, and getting that message out there to explain, you know, as in a rhythm to whether it's a graduate to your most senior position in the company, what exactly that business model uniquely is. I think that's not done well enough. So that's a big part of the challenge of communication. And all of a sudden you've got lots of stakeholders with various needs, and that's also a key skill you need then once you get to Series A that hires perhaps may not have needed before as one team. So you're really supporting, you know, that sort of challenge. So you're moving from talent is still a big challenge, but there's also now an introduction of a load of people, you know, challenges and systems design you need to think about. And, you know, B to C, then you've obviously got a lot more data to use to be a lot more data informed in conversations, and you can move further down the line into center of excellences, and you've got the wider challenges then, I think, of geographical expansion and what comes with that for culture, what comes with that for org design and so forth. But yeah, that tends to be talent plus people, and you're thinking much more around the 10 to international expansion complexity as you get, you know, true or deep product market fit.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people that will resonate what you said. There are a lot of people, especially about that make or break thing. Like the amount of times I've seen organizations completely collapse when everything really is in their favor at that point, and it seems to be mostly around people and culture. Where that a lot of that is kind of make or break. Yes, there's the operational side of things and so on, but I think more than anything, there seems to be a tendency, especially for those that raise a significant Series A at that stage, to they're obviously encouraged by their investors and their shareholders to go out and find the big boy talent, right? The ex Googles, the ex Amazons. It's like, right, time to fill your board, time to fill your exec team, and of course, you know, like you said, when you're working with those startups where it's scrappy and you're going to Tesco's and buying the pot noodles and the packet of crisps, to suddenly have these really corporate individuals come in and start telling you what to do when you've been there, sort of building it yourself and sweating over it, it can be really demoralizing. And there's not enough, I think, individuals like yourself maybe sort of giving them that insight and guidance to say it's one thing to go out and hire these individuals, and that's fine, but it's another thing to integrate them well and in a way that doesn't completely destroy the culture that you've spent so long building, right? Is that something that you've seen?
Yeah, completely agree. I think, and it's also on the candidate point of view as well, which is why I always say stage fit situational relevance is almost like the number one thing I try to double down on, aside from obviously values alignment, because, you know, you hire someone that's too far down the line, you know, regarding logos or whatever. And the challenge that they also have is in the culture naturally in startups is everyone is challenging everybody. Ideas can come from anywhere. Right. So even if you've got a lot of experience, and the trust is very important, and the delegation, it works both sides. You know, you should still be comfortable, even though you are the expert, to be challenged on that by somebody that doesn't understand what you're talking about, or a graduate can challenge you, even if you've got 20 years under your belt or whatever. So I think that that's also on the candidate side. But to your point, yes, it's the first time that, you know, a founder is now having their team as opposed to one team as the whole company, and that then is the leadership team, and that comes with all its challenges around. You know, they are a hiring manager, right? So you're having to level them up very quickly. There's just the same as, you know, other first-time managers on how to onboard, you know, a leader, and a senior leader onboarding is different to a standard individual contributor workflow, so to speak. So it's training them on the importance of that. It's training them to recognize performance of a leader within 100 days, 90 days, or whatever, and how that looks for a startup leader versus a more experienced leader who's coming in against a 5-year plan that's pretty defined in a more mature market, or not creating a market or whatever. So you've got all of that added complexity and nuance to startups as well. So it's not easy, and I always say, generally in culture, you're taking teams on a journey always to know what's kind of next where possible in terms of the step change that happens and the inflection points between rounds. But again, it's a lived experience. There's only so much you can say of what's coming for them. And part of the mentoring and coaching is actually to play out scenarios, which I do with them, that I've experienced or that happens. So it's not necessarily a surprise. At least these are familiar concepts that they've had territory. So, crisis management. You've hired a leader. It's your first leader. They're not performing. It doesn't work out. What are you going to do? We talk about these things.
What's your plan B, kind of thing?
Yeah. What's your plan B? When to think about. I wouldn't say my depth is board. I'll be very frank. But when to think about different board appointments, what that makeup needs to look like, and why. Advisory network, so forth, because they need a support system as soon as they hit that Series A, and it needs to be effective. Because there is so much that all of a sudden changes very, very, very quickly for a first-time founder in particular. So yeah, it's how can you prepare them for that, have a bit of a strategy tactically and a bit longer term thinking, and B, what are the absolute critical things that they need to baseline level up with very, very quickly in order to be effective and don't burn out.
A friendly reminder to share this episode with your network, like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the show and only takes a couple of minutes.
And that's the thing I don't think is really talked about enough when we talk about organizational growth is the effect that it has on the founder, because everything starts from the top, right? And more often than not, like you highlighted there, for first-time founders especially, the culture shock that they experience is just the same as sometimes some of that other founding team members, if not more so, because they don't actually get to experience being what an actual founder, a CEO. Well, they're a founder, but not what a CEO is for some time. Sometimes, I've worked with some founders that have been building their startup over a period of, say, 5, 6, 7 years, and then they reach that point. That's a very long time to get comfortable with a certain way of doing things. To suddenly then go, oh crap, actually, this is what being a CEO is meant to be like, and it's not for everyone. And at that point, that sometimes I've seen people who just want to run for the hills. They're like, this isn't what I thought it would be. I thought it would be like that forever, and that can be really disorienting. It's disorienting. So yeah, I can imagine. I do think that's something that needs to be explored more in conversation for people to hear about. They have that expectation going in that the role is going to change drastically. And
very good point. It's understanding the definition of the CEO role. I think that's the first conversation you kind of start with, because you're not
a CEO in the beginning.
Yeah. Oh no,
you're
of course not. No. Yeah. And you're still a founder, right? But it's your founder CEO, and what does the CEO job spec actually look like is an important conversation to have, actually. And what that looks like between perhaps multiple co-founders and so forth, so the role definitions become clearer. Particularly when boards or whatever down the line start advising, a COO comes in or whatever, or a chief of staff and so forth. So I think the boundaries and the roles are important. But also, to your point, as you said, with the shift, I've seen very successful bootstrap businesses then take on, say, like a Series A round and skip sort of C because of traction. That's difficult for them.
Yes.
So that's been an interesting transition. But I've seen all sorts. Right, I'll be very honest. Burnout, and the thing I think that again, it does come with experience, but founders are human beings. That's the end of it. They're no different to you. I'm one on a much smaller scale now myself, but they're just people. I've seen everything. Honestly, I've seen tears, overwhelmed, things in the family. It's like being in a marriage. Everything. You're a confidant. You've got to prepare them, and I think it's there's a lot of things people don't see that the founder experiences through. And I've said previously on other conversations before that a lot of the role as well as a people leader is also taking the team around them and building empathy across the whole leadership team for one another. Because I think sometimes, yes, the founder, CEO has to be decisive and be able to make decisions. That's basically the CEO in a role in a nutshell. But also, you know, it's their first rodeo. They're going to make mistakes. There's a huge amount of pressure on them as an individual. And I'll be honest, I don't think it's easier for two versus one. I've seen two co-founders really struggle individually and together. I've seen solo founders be amazingly resilient and decisive, and you know, of course, there's mental health and fitness for everybody, but you know, I don't think two versus one really makes too much of a difference in terms of resilience, in terms of peaks and troughs that happen at all stages of, you know, our mental well-being as we go through that journey. So you just have to take it case by case with the founder that you're working with.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you mentioned there as well about kind of what a lot of people don't see. I mean, that's kind of part of the course as well to some degree, and that's why, you know, as advisors, mentors, all that sort of thing, we have to see it, and why I think it's such a recommended thing for founders to do is because you know, as a founder or CEO, as a leader, you don't really want to be exposing your team to your vulnerabilities. You know, to you know, a lot of the time, especially when there's, you know, some very critical moments happening within the company, it's not going to inspire necessarily the confidence that you want to, you know, in your team. So I totally get that, and you know, having run teams myself, I've experienced that firsthand. So you do have to go to people outside, technically outside of the organization, to share your vulnerabilities with, or concerns, and so on, because you know, you can't really even do it with sometimes with co-founding team, you know, co-founders or other executive members, because again, that can have a ripple effect. So you know, especially if it's like concern over whether or not a big deal is going to go through, and whether or not you're going to be able to make payroll next month, like that's the last thing that you want to sort of spread. You know, at least at a certain organizational level. Maybe when you're smaller, that's fine, but you know, once things get, you know, more intense, it's a very dangerous game to play about, you know, finding the balance between being transparent and honest, but also doing your job, which is to ensure that everyone feels confident in the vision and the mission at hand. It's very difficult.
Yeah, I completely agree. And transparency, I suppose, is the word there, because I think, you know, first of all, you have to hire leaders at that level in the leadership team, and I mean the CEO's team, that are resilient enough and desire that transparency and commitment to the ups and downs of a business. That's fundamental, because if you can't share some of those vulnerabilities with that leadership team whatsoever, you've got it. That's not a resilient and a true startup leadership team. You know, leadership team have to absolutely have an appetite for risk or calculated risk, and absolutely have to be committed to weather the storm that a business will go through one way or the other. So I think that's the first thing, though, and it's a balance. I'm not sure how I would codify what exactly that looks like. I'd need a bit more time, but I felt that and being part of it. I felt it and being part of it. But on the flip side, as you said, you know, our role as leaders, just like if we are a leadership team with our own functional teams, then there's an element of protection and you know, what's not relevant for them to perform and so forth, that you do shield the teams on to an extent. And just like in a relationship, and I say this to founders, in your personal life, you know, marriage or partners, whatever, or in life, it's good to have, you know, a coach or a therapist, whatever. I think everyone needs that space, completely objective, outside, because the thing about discussing any problem with people who know you is it's always irrelevant, you know, a degree of subjectivity to it, and seen through, they're looking at giving you advice through the lens of you and what, you know, who you are and how you might respond to the feedback regardless. So you never really get a true objective sort of cold face view. So speaking to someone completely, you know, outside of all the dynamics that you might have is really, really useful. That said, the challenge sometimes with that advice is when they don't have sometimes that context of wider dynamics, that advice can sometimes not land as well in terms of how that advice is given and is executed, because they don't have the context. And this is like my own coaching journey, learned this. coaching, I think, is very useful, but I think a 360 on a founder as a coach before you start is also highly valuable. And some coaches do that and some don't, and there's pros and cons to that. But in my opinion, when I've done 360 and had more context or around that, that's important. And the reason I say that's important for coaching is because how do you define the definition of a good coach? In my opinion, it's the change in perception of others around that person's behavior, and it's hard to measure that if you're not actually speaking to some of those people around to see the impact of that person's behavioral change and so forth. So yeah, of course, part of their own feeling is important part of that, but typically we feel good when other people are responding in the right way we want them to around us. So it kind of goes hand in hand.
Yeah, 360 is something I always try and do with any founders that are kind of a bit further along in their journey, at least. I think earlier stage, it's maybe not as important to me, but I totally see what you're saying. And it's something that I used to do when I was working for startups. If I was going to be hired, I would ask for references from the team on the founders, and I think that's an incredibly important thing to do. Like, if you're going to be starting joining a startup, actually get some references of people that have been there and work with them closely, because I think that's a really important thing. Because, like you said, the culture is such an important part of it at those early stages that you need to know. Okay, yes, they're making a judgment on me if I'm going to be a good fit, but I also need to do the same thing. And I want to see that being a lot more of an accepted thing, actually asking for references in the other direction these days.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I tell you, I'm going to write about this because this is a very good point you say is...
You're welcome. You can credit me in the bottom.
I will.
Send you an invoice later.
I think I love it, because to your point, and I really, really, really believe this is also critical, right? When you're interviewing, it is a two-way thing, absolutely. And I think when you're a candidate, you're so thinking about how you come across and wanting to get the job and so forth, you forget that. I think a lot of people go into companies and they know nothing about them deep down. They haven't used that time. And I think as a high performer, very good high performers get a huge amount of value out of the time that they've got in front of them. And I would like to see more candidates doing that, really thoughtful of their questions that they want to ask, what information is important to them, and extract a lot of information out of the business that they can and the people in front of them as part of that. I don't see it done enough. And I do think that's, we both in a relationship, have the responsibility through that interview process to make sure that we align. It's not just the employer or to assess suitability, it's also, you, and you also know what works for you.
I agree, but I also think, to play devil's advocate a bit there, that it's also more of the responsibility of the organization to facilitate that than it is necessarily for the candidate to do that. Because quite often there are candidates that are applying for many roles, like especially when we talk about tech layoffs, to ask them, and I've seen this time and time again where candidates are asked to jump through ridiculous amounts of hoops for roles, especially for things like sales leadership or customer success leadership and so on. And it's like you're expected to know the last 10 years history of every single person that worked there, the performance of the company, their mission statement, their vision, do a report, write your 90-day presentation, like that's nuts, considering that sometimes these individuals are applying to 20 jobs a week, if not more. So I feel like there has to be a little bit of an understanding that you're not the only company they're applying for. Stop expecting them to kiss your ass, right? They just sometimes they just want a job and they will go with a good opportunity. And second, if we understand that cultural fit and hitting the ground running and all of that is so important, make that easy. Offer these referrals. Offer these references from team members. Like, do you want to know what it's like to work? Here the phone numbers and the email addresses of these people that I work with. These. You know what I mean? Like, I think there needs to be a bit more of that baked in. To be honest,
I agree. I completely agree. So part of the design experience that the employer should have is how does managing expectations sit from the website, the career site, right the way through to the interview experience they're having. So in the information that you give them, it manages their expectations on what to expect and what it's like to work here. I mean, that is the whole point of that experience from the design perspective when you've got a proper talent person in there. I completely agree. And whether that's threading in, meeting different representation parts of the business, your best performer, perhaps, you know, to be honest, your weaker performer, like whoever you want to put in front of them to see that. I think that's important. But also, I think, you know, there is also, you know, innately in startups a bias to action. And I think, you know, bear in mind when, you know, I appreciate you're saying, you know, vast majority or certain demographic will only want a job. Fair enough. Do you want that person in your company? That's the first thing. And you might in certain roles. That's the first thing I think an employer needs to recognize in their design experience. But secondly, if you are a candidate, there are a few points in your life that are most important that you make a decision. Probably your partner, perhaps financial investments that you're making, your house or whatever, and your job. You know, your job is 70-80%, probably more, you know, obviously the math, 5 perhaps more days a week if you're in a startup, you know, of time investment. It's a serious commitment. So while I completely appreciate you may be spreading across 10, 15 particular positions, you know, at the end of the day, your career is your career. It's not the employer's. You know, your path you're going on and the decisions that you make are yours to own. And that bit of ownership is also equally, in my opinion, important. I really believe.
Oh yeah, no, I agree 100%. But it's just, my point is more just that I think it has to be a little bit more equal. And I feel like at the moment,
I agree. I do
for
agree.
the majority, it seems to fall more to the candidate to do that and demonstrate that than it does a lot of startups. And you know, the risk is equal on both sides of the coin there. You know,
agree.
it's just as much of a risk to go and work for a startup as it is to employ someone for the first time. And especially if I think about my background, my background is you know, in sales and marketing, and you know, being a high performer in sales teams and then leadership and so on, and followed that journey into C-suite. And you know, sales is really hard, and you know, the average tenure for it is insanely low compared to other roles. I mean, if you're hiring salespeople, you know, you should be really doing a good job at selling yourself to them. Like, is my point, especially if they're talented. Like, you know, and salespeople are not, I'm afraid to say, they don't really give too much of a shit about you as a company. They're going to find the best opportunity, the one that offers or seems to offer the best amount of security, a product that they believe in. They're not going to sit there and go, oh, well, that you know, their values really align with mine. That's not really as big a concern as it may be with someone who's like working in, I don't know, customer support, especially when you talk about, you know, at the Series A stage and onwards. Maybe in the earlier stages, okay, maybe. But, you know, when you are just one in a team of 20, 30, 50, I don't think that matters as much to people. And I don't think it necessarily matters. It should matter as much to the hiring managers either. You need people who can do the job.
Yeah, so I think yes and no. I think this comes down to like fundamentally. So there's two things. For the original point, I think why are employers bad at this? You know, generally the experience and the onus then is put too heavily on the candidate. That's basically just down to be honest, lack of investment into the talent and into the value in talent for a start, and lack of intentional design. That's quite frankly, right? You know, people don't think these things through. They go off hiring.
Time and money constraints, right? It's like we need to hire some people quick. You know, yeah.
True. And it's always the trade-off then of time versus quality and so forth. And that's always then, and that's why, you know, even in people in talent, you need to understand, you know, minimal viable product and minimal viable experience. Like what's going to give the most value on closing the candidate that's, you know, quick to get out there and de-risks the company to not have our sort of lowest performance baseline, you know, dropped, you know, even further. So I think that's all of that. But your second point was more around the values and sales. I mean, fundamentally, this comes down to like, what's your definition of high performance and what actually drives high performance in your company fundamentally, right? Because if it's not a values-led culture properly, that's where values, to be honest, you know, even as you scale to teams functionally, just don't work, and then teams don't care about them, you know, and so forth. And, you know, values on collaboration and sales, you know, in my opinion, it's very important when you're scaling a sales engine. Cross-selling is very important, and to me that's collaboration, right? So I think those values can very much translate into a sales culture. It just depends on, you know, how much the values truly are lived and how that ties into performance fundamentally to make the business more money. Simple as that. And yes, you are going to have micro cultures at scale whereby the sales team operates very differently to tech. You know, they you know, I've been in them enough time, and I'm from sales certificate. I'm an ex-agency recruiter. I know all about that. You know, there's an element of more individualism by nature and competitiveness that's in that. And you know, there is slightly different incentives that are, you know, whether we agree or not, entrenched in sales. It's hard to decouple that, given the market is still perpetuating, you know, those incentives in the way that you work and so forth. So yes, it is different, but I do think the glue fundamentally, also why people often leave, I do still think it comes back to culture. And the reason I say this is I worked at a company years ago with an absolutely shockingly pants commission structure, and I got offered all the time way more money to go into other places and opportunity, and I didn't leave. And the reason for that was because of the culture. And I think, you know, you can sell your soul, but I do think the best salespeople, in my opinion, have like strong principles on the product, the success factors and nature of building the company's success. I think the short-termism in sales doesn't lead to sustainable growth. So you still need to hire salespeople that care about sustainability. And that comes down to clean data, codification, cross-selling, you know, upselling, and looking at building, you know, advocacy across the client and all of that sort of stuff. So I think, you know, that's how I look at it anyway.
No, I very broadly agree with you on that, but I would say, again, just to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit.
Oh, no, fine. That's what we're here for. Yeah.
That's what we do. Is I think the more sort of seasoned salespeople realize that that's a zero-sum game, because as much as you can care about the long game, as you pointed out there, ultimately a company is only as good as its last P&L. And so while you may be playing that game, the company will still look at you as you are only as good as your last deal. And they've come to that harsh reality. You know, I've been there. I know many others that have. That as much as you can really value those things that you've put forward, you're on the chopping block the minute things go slightly wrong through no fault of your own. And I think that's where a lot. I mean, you know, I'm talking very specifically now, and we're focusing very specifically now on sales culture. But I think it's fair to say that you know, the vast majority of, when you look at sales culture across the startup ecosystem, it's pretty broken, like for these fundamental reasons that, you know, and then on top of that, you've got sales leaders who I think operate in a way that, again, is actually furthering the opposite of what you're saying, even if it's counter to the overall culture of the company. They still operate on that very short-term basis, and so you end up with these very conflicting sort of values, I think, more often than not, especially once a company gets to a certain size where it needs to continuously show a certain amount of growth. It's tough.
I think there's some, and I do think there's some fair points in that, as I think, you know, sales are always wrongly vulnerable because they're the function that has, you know, well, it's numerical and it's very obvious on performance and output and so forth, where other functions much later evolve that type of performance framework and performance visibility. And I don't agree with that. That tends to what happens, because I feel that myself in recruitment, right? You know, you're more exposed than other teams early on because the numbers and so forth, and that's not right. And that's why it's important as a people leader to go in to look at total business performance and how that translates across the business. So I think that's it. And then secondly, I think it's quite systemic. I think, you know, going back to setting the right incentives and the right metrics that lead to sustainable growth and not short-termism. That's the business top-down fundamental issue that perpetuates bad behavior and vulnerability for that team consequently, which then, as you said, you know, wouldn't be a fault of their own. There are wider factors, which unfortunately is for all the company then, and sales might obviously feel this first and see that in the data of the market, is A, it's market risk, and, you know, while commercial will drag a company, and rightly so in my opinion, is the product ready? That's also a problem which happens where you've got too many sales, you're pushing stuff, and the product readiness just isn't there. And I don't mean selling a roadmap that then needs to be built. That's slightly different. So I think that's the challenge. So yeah, I have a lot of empathy for sales. I've been in sales. I am a salesperson by nature. I get it. But it comes back to first principles. For example, I've interviewed loads of VP of Peoples recently. Fantastic. It's given loads of, real faith in the people discipline by speaking to top level VPs and CPOs in London. One of the things though, and this is no disrespect, it's not their fault, but you speak to all of them about performance, and they all using the same methodology and framework. And so have I, and it's easy. It's not, but not one of them in the market had sat down to challenge. Think, why are we still doing this? It doesn't work. No one.
Well, that's exactly why my startup exists. I'm hoping to challenge that. By very definition.
I completely agree, but again, no one's fault. It's the hamster wheel of, again, right. As I said, I am in a luxurious position to say this because I'm out of this now. I don't now have stakeholder pressure to get stuff done. I don't have a CEO or an investor on my back, and so forth. It's easy for me to say this, but I that's my point. Fundamentally, if you want to change the world, you have to break things down completely to the why, and try and forget everything that you've known today. And it's incredibly hard, and I can't say, I've done this always, but performance is something I'm fundamentally doing a lot of research in my spare time on, because when I into this market, the penny dropped and I was like, something's not right here. This doesn't we've got this wrong. And yeah, so I'm going to write about this in a lot more detail, and I think it affects, as you said, sales, every function.
Every function, absolutely, and I agree, and I think this is down to the fact that ultimately we've got there's a kind of an upwards funnel for the way that information is put across in businesses, and then it goes all the way up to the stakeholders, the VCs and so on, and so by design, and this is no one's fault. I think just by design, it has to be simplified across each step so that it can be easily digested. And so of course the most obvious numbers that any investor, board of directors, whatever is going to look at is just, did they achieve revenue? Did they achieve these targets? And that has no bearing on skill, on talent, on culture, nothing. And so that all of what we're talking about becomes essentially redundant at some point, no matter what the best intention were of the founders at the earlier stages or through the period of building the company and putting all these values in place. Ultimately, you end up being a slave to those numbers. And I agree with you. I think something needs to change there, which is exactly why I'm building the startup I'm building, where the focus is then on quantifying skill. That's what we're looking at, right? And I think that has a huge impact across the board, so that actually what you can do is you can create a set of very clear metrics that demonstrate skill. So if there is a reason to have to axe half of your staff or whatever for whatever reason, you, instead of doing it based on numbers, you can go, well, okay, these group of individuals may not have brought in the numbers, but they have the highest level of skill, which means that when we need to rebuild, these are the people we need to keep. You know what I mean? Like it's looking at things, I think, through a level of thing which is far more important, because, or it could be skill that you have invested in, right? To get them to that skill, you could see the journey that they've taken from beginning with you and the increase and improvement on that skill. I think all of that is the direction we should be going for. It should be skill and talent focus as opposed to results focus, because of good results doesn't always equal good skill.
If you are enjoying this episode and want to support the show, please like and subscribe with notifications turned on.
Well, and again, it's all about consistency and what and compounding over time. So I think
and strength, right? Because it's also about having that all together, and does that demonstrate strength to be resilient, weather storms, etc. Right?
Exactly, I completely agree on that front. And I think, but I also we have. We're in a capitalist society, so I'm very, very, very sensitive and aware that fundamentally the definition of culture or the outcome of culture is going to be where you sit in the market, right? So it fundamentally is market share and so forth. So I think you have to work back from that, and I don't have an issue with the North Stars as they are, I think that the challenge, though, fundamentally lies in the inputs. Effectively of, like, as you said, what does actually lead to high performance? Is it and this is where I think values does have a place to be revived. I think we've lost our way massively on it, and I think that's a separate conversation. But I think what was I going to say? My point to that was, I think talent density, which a lot of good VPs and CPOs measure, but what does that mean? What does that look like? Skills acquisition, growth. At the end of the day, if you're a growth business, and growth is fundamentally important to your business strategy in all levels, and how does that translate into people in terms of skill acquisition? The rate of growth, the training that fundamentally goes into that. How many courses, promotions, skills have we acquired this year? Blah, blah, blah. So, it all has to tie in. And I think that's part of the issue, though. And again, no one's fault here, but we have a lot of these strategies quite disjointed. And I think, educating on high performance and what that really means, that took me a long time. I'm going to be honest, to really recognize the fundamental importance of, like, products are great, systems, flows, great processes, all that, but fundamentally at the highest level, understanding the connectivity of market share and, retention, sustainable growth, acquisition, whatever, and how that then translates into the business. I know this is much more sort of strategic sort of stuff, but that in itself is, you have to get the leadership team around a table to really fundamentally understand that at its fundamental level of for business success.
Yeah, I agree. And for me, something that I've similar to you, spent a lot of time thinking about all these various things over the years. And one thing that's become quite apparent to me, I think, as definitely a big blind spot for a lot of organizations, is the understanding of what great looks like.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
And then, really leveraging that to implement a very resilient and solid foundation of best practice. And so going back to what you're saying about values and how we can do better there, I think one of the core values that we can do better on is this idea that we need to constantly evaluate and improve what it is we do as individuals and as a team and as a company. And I think if you do those two things, I think, from my hypothesis, I guess, and what I've built an entire company on, so I hope I'm right, is in theory, you should be able to address a lot of the things I think you mentioned there.
Yeah.
Because it's about purposely trying to identify what great performance is, what it looks like, and what the actual attributes of that are. And then once you do that, record them and tell everyone else, and say, this is the benchmark, and I think that's missing, because quite often, especially in sales, to go back to that example, but it works across the board. It's too often, it's like, it's a bit of a, Lone Ranger-esque kind of approach to it. It's like, well, if this is working, let's just give that person more resources to continue to work, as opposed to, what are you doing? Tell everyone else.
Completely agree, and you hit the nail on the head. And I would even take it further and say it's the two extremities you have to communicate. So first of all, the big issue is, how do we define what high performance is, and that's key. But then the other extremity is, what is the lowest standard of performance that you tolerate in the business?
Right.
Because the people also then need to know the polar opposite of, like, because when you have true high performance, however we define that, then actually, and I don't like to go into the metrics then of ratings and all the rest of it, because that's my point. I think this is broken. But let's just say then there's a vast pool of there that are core performers. If your standards are that high on high performance, then actually then having core people that are above this baseline, your lowest level of high performance, which is ideally over and above everybody else's high performance bar, then actually that's not a bad thing. And I think that's the point of, again, we're measuring stuff, but we don't even know what we've defined. That's a big issue going on in the people space right now. So
that's good to know. That's good to know that I'm on the right path with my business. Then, if that's a big issue,
we should talk more after this, regardless, because I'm really deeply interested in this. It's probably my biggest thing outside of talent. I'm most interested in is this.
Likewise. And I see it all as being very related. But look, Yeah, but not to get too stuck on that. I'm curious to know as well about on the other end of the scale, like talking. Obviously, you work with founders across the whole journey, as it were. And at the earlier stage, I've definitely recognised, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this. That quite often they have no idea what they want from talent at that stage. How do you tend to address that, and what advice would you maybe give to founders who are in a position where they now need to start hiring, to be able to sit down and actually start thinking about what attributes do I actually need from these first hires, from my first team leads, or even just team members? Because that's a really difficult part, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's different lenses to look at this, because in my younger days, you'd be like, well, you should know, if you're a hiring manager, you should know. But as if you're disrupting the market, or the thing about startups is often you're doing things that you haven't done before. When you're looking at right sizing or structuring the business, I'm talking more total org chart, it's you're kind of all in it together, working that out as you go. So there's an element of like, you're not going to have all the answers, I don't think, when you're building a startup, no matter how experienced you might be, when it comes to getting the total org design right. And there is no cookie cutter, beautiful, someone can execute that brilliantly and no right sizing happens. It just doesn't exist.
Just me. I'm the only one that
no,
you're absolutely right.
Well, I'll come and work with you then. But to your point, yes. So there's an element of thinking when I go to speak to a client, and I don't want to call them necessarily a customer because they're a founder, but let's just say this is, when you're speaking to a customer in any business, it's not for the customer to tell you what they need. That's your job to listen and then work out. That's the whole point of building product and building that sort of stuff, right? So when I'm with a founder, I don't now go into that meeting thing, well, you should know, or any leader really, you should know the answer to this to a degree, as they are more seasoned. But it's listening to the actual needs and going for that qualification together, because they may have an idea, but you're right, 9 times out of 10, particularly a seed, it will even Series A, but definitely at seed, the thing they think they need is never ever what we end up with. And that's an exercise truly to work out, at this stage in time, what are the problems are, the milestones. And again, this is ironic, but a big fundamental question that they haven't thought about when they're thinking about the talent is what milestones they're hitting. Because that's the bit we're working back from, is actually what are all these people that we need to achieve by year end or the next 6 months, or however far we decide to look out, and work back on the skills, ability, behaviors, and all the rest of it that we need from that point. So role, as you said, people are knighted with the founder CEO title, but they haven't seen a CEO job description before. So a lot of that at seed stage is educating them about what the roles actually are, and how might they bring value.
And especially because of CEOs tend to fall usually into one or two categories, which is someone with a commercial background of some sort, marketing and sales, who has very little knowledge about the tech side of things because they've outsourced that, or the other way around. And so when it comes to hiring in positions that they're not familiar with, it's unknown territory. They have no idea. Tech founders, especially that I've worked with, when they have to hire commercial individuals, they have no idea what they're meant to be looking for, which is why I'm a huge advocate for, I don't know if you've seen any of the stuff online, but I talk a lot about why I believe founders should learn as much about sales as possible, regardless of their background, for that very reason. But yeah, it's tough. But, there's some founders I've worked with which have said very openly, we're interviewing right now so that we can actually get a better understanding of what our job description should be. Like, that's what they're doing, It's like, and I'm like, okay, one way to do it. I'm not sure how the candidates would feel about that if you told them, but they don't know what they want until they see it sometimes,
Yes, I think that's a natural part of iteration at the expense of the market. That does happen, but I talk about this a lot on actually on scenarios with founders, that how do we this is one of the things we role play and I prepare them for, is what's our strategy for unfamiliar roles? Or so what do we mean by this? So a role you've never hired before, or a new function we're going to create down the line, or we've got this really niche, obscure, I don't know, squeary, weary technical role that none of us kind of really know, and maybe there's only like 3 in the world, or like NVIDIA or someone's got one there, but no one else does. So how do we actually think about filling these? And this is actually a more broader discussion we coach and mentor them on. But one of the things I talk about, that Brian Chesky talks about on podcast that he said he did, was when he started off, just spoke tons and tons and tons to the market before he hired. So he didn't use the market, spoke to loads of people and who knew the best that they knew in product or whatever role it was he was looking for, to really understand the roles first. Now, of course, you might not have the luxury of time, but, you know, a CEO should be speaking to, you know, a COO versus, you know, understanding the difference of a CRO to a CCO or whatever, and just really speaking to people to build up that intelligence, because it's how recruiters, which a CEO needs to be, it's how a recruiter learns. A recruiter learns more and more and more about their roles by speaking to the candidates. And the idea is you should always be recruiting and speaking to the market, not just using that role when you urgently need it, because most of the time we hire too late. So then you're using the market, you're constrained, so you're not really evaluating and think about it. And the problem when you use the market, which is why I explained to founders, we want to always be recruiting and try and learn about these roles as much, whether we're reading, Googling job specs, speaking to our investors saying, can you make interest your best person you know? Might not need them now, but let's learn more about this discipline of product marketing or this, and this. Is if you just go to market when you need the role to learn all about it, there's a few things you put at risk here. One, you may miss on very good talent that you spoke to originally because you've decided to take 2 months to kind of work out who you want. So that's the issue there, because you just really don't know what you're looking for. The second is you're likely to use in the beginning to give you some leverage and firepower an outsourced, you know, agent or someone like me, a partner or whatever, and they will get frustrated in the fact that you haven't built up any of that sort of, you know, there's iteration, but then there's also trying to look at the whole market, and you can't look at the whole market in the space of 3 weeks. It's just, you know, you need to slice it, and I agree with slicing, but that's also, you know, you have to be relatively confident on your decision making at that point, with low data. And the third part of that as well then is, of course, like the whole point then is of candidate experience and your brand and what you want to give out to the market, like you quite rightly mentioned. You know, how do the candidates feel about that? If you know, the candidates aren't stupid. It becomes quite obvious if you don't know what you're looking for in an interview, and they'll give that feedback back quite quickly. Believe me. So you want to be thinking about brand relatively early on, and that brand, I believe, starts with your behaviours.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's also something that I've been a bit vocal on over the years as well. Is I think that there's a lot to be said for early stage startups doing as much as they can from a brand perspective in terms of showing behind the scenes type content online, because actually what that does, I mean, it does an enormous amount of things for you from a perspective of investor relations, building up a bit of an online profile, even customer acquisition, but also from building a recruitment pipeline. You know, you can build I've seen it done really well by some startups over the recent years, where, you know, they've got people clawing at their door to go and work for them because they've seen, you know, what's going on behind the scenes, how transparent they are about culture and so on. So it's another, I think, important part of being a startup in 2024, I would say. But I wanted to ask one last thing before I let you go, which was about career development within startups and how, what your sort of idea of that is, because I think a lot of people have had very mixed experiences with career development. I've seen it, and I've also been a part of it as well too, to the point where, you know, there's a lot to be said for what happens at these various stages of funding and how that can have sometimes quite a negative effect on earlier sort of employees of startups who maybe miss out on certain opportunities. You know, to be more specific by what I mean by that, you know, you'll have sometimes a lot of the founding team, you know, be there from the beginning, really put their blood, sweat and tears in it with promises of promotions X, Y, and Z, and then, you know, Series A lands and they're like, oh no, we're actually going to be hiring externally for all these roles. What's your experience with that, and what do you tend to advise founders to kind of ensure that those that were there from the beginning are being given the attention they deserve to further themselves in their career, even if they are lacking maybe the skills to step up to the plate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've been in very difficult positions where I've been parachuted in and all sorts of promises were made, and we had all sorts of issues with that. It's not easy. It's not nice, and no one wants to have those conversations, but they have to be done nonetheless. So I think there's a few things to look at this. I think, look, my business head says a few things. What does fundamentally growth mean at your company? And spell that out, right? Because, you know, is it that you're promising people accelerated careers? Or is it that you're giving people a set of skills that they can't get somewhere else, in terms of, whatever that experience looks like? And fundamentally, in that system or in that picture, what is our role as an employer, what we're going to give you, and what do we expect from you? Because career development is owned by the employee. No, it's not the business's job to tell you where you're going to be in 5 years' time, because you might want to be in Zimbabwe or starting your own company in Silicon Valley or go wherever, right? So only you know where you want to be 5-10 years' time. And the company is a vehicle that you need to help you go on that journey, but it's not the company then to tell you that and completely be responsible for making that happen, right? It's you explaining where your goals are. The company will tell you how then the OKRs of the projects and the opportunities would support you getting there, and what you would need to do expectation wise for that both to align based on what our expectation is for level 2, level 3, or whatever. And then it's your role, it's you to decide whether you agree with that time frame or agree on what the business can offer, and you stay there, or you go somewhere else which may be able to do that. So I think again, ownership for growth and performance, I do believe that, and I am an employee as well, don't forget, I have been, so I believe this is myself being an employee. We have to take our ownership of our destiny in many respects of that. The employer, though, is a good guide and is a good enabler, but it's not the owner of your career destiny. Nobody should tell you what you can and can't do in your life. Go and find it. If the business isn't prepared to give you it, go and find it. But I agree on I do agree on what I've had to draw when I did my international roadshow for my last company. I was going around, I was drawing to them the cycle of how growth is enabled. And fundamentally, if the business isn't successful by the input we have to give to get, if we don't now get what we need by the Series A, we can't reinvest back into people. So we can't at this point give all this promotion promises, or because we haven't even got the results yet, guys. We have to now put in the work to get product market fit. We have to get this out, and that's the whole point of fundamentally why you have to explain to people the importance of, unfortunately, some of these hard capitalist numbers of revenue and so forth, or whatever we decide that business milestone is. Because if we don't hit that, we can't invest back into the business, and we can't keep growing. And it is that interconnected cycle to explain to people. And this is why fundamentally that is important, because I can tell you this now from being in business long enough, people are not happy when the business isn't doing well. So you have to get that wheel happening in terms of input. We're going to give, it's going to be annoying, but the business then and any relationship should be giving back a degree for that. And how does that look like in our reward and our growth cycle against our goals and so forth? But it fundamentally comes down to your business model, or not even your business model. It comes down to what you want your culture to be. Do you want a culture more stick and carrot, and you want it to be more transactional? And that does work for some cultures, and some people just want that, and they're happy to be more money oriented and less about the growth bit. Other people will take a lower percentile of the range of the market and the salary. They want to learn loads. They want a strong learning culture. They want great leader coaches or player coaches, whatever, in the leadership role. So it does come down to fundamentally what you want your company to double down on in its value prop, that people want to be part of it. Because in some businesses, career development and growth is going to be way more important than other businesses, where that's going to be perhaps less of a incentive to invest into the business. And it depends on your growth scale. If you are doing X investment in growth, and I mean in terms of skills, everything in your business, and you're going, let's say, 20% this year, you then decide to do 60% growth next year, then growth of your whole team to level up is going to be very important to enable to do that, right? For sustainable growth, because it will likely be cheaper to develop your existing team than keep hiring from the outside.
But then you need to plan for that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think there's a rule of thumb somewhere. I think the seed is hard because the intention, I think hiring is badly done at seed. I do historically, rightly or wrongly, see a lot of those hires struggle on the A to B journey. That is the problem, and we've got to get the seed bit right, and we've got to get timing right, which is an extremely difficult challenge. of getting people in close enough to the A, whereby they may be a little bit overqualified and work backwards a little bit for 6 months and then can keep growing because they kind of grow into themselves and then accelerate with the rate of growth of the company, is hard.
Yeah.
So that is always really difficult. I will agree. And I've very in success on that. And I've learned a lot through trial and error on that as a talent leader. So yeah, I don't know if that gives you much of an answer.
No, it's definitely very useful, I think, for people to hear. I've got a ton more questions, but we're out of time, so we're going to have to do this again. But I suppose if I can take away any one thing from you that's really stood out, especially in that answer to me, is I think something that I have a feeling you probably say a lot to people, and I certainly do, or founders I should be more specific on, which is essentially it's your business. Yeah. Run it how you want to run it. Right?
I agree.
And I think that's a really important thing to remember, especially when there's so many people like us giving advice, and there's so many other stakeholders and co-founders and VCs and all this giving their opinion on everything. It's your business. Run it how you want to run it. And I think that's a good message to give people.
And that's very important as an advisor, or as a coach. This is why I don't conflate all these services together at the same time. If I'm a coach, it's strictly coaching. And if I'm an advisor or designer, so forth. Because when you're designing, you have an invested interest to influence the outcome. If you're an advisor, people can take or leave that advice. And you always have a caveat to that. I'm giving the advice based on what you've literally just told me, and so forth. And coaching isn't advising. Coaching is... I class mine a bit more centering because there is some more baseline practical tools in there that it is important to level them up. But I think that's the important part to really, if you are transitioning to advisor role, to be at peace with. Because sometimes, I'll be very frank, I have VCs sometimes being very honest, wanting me to influence sometimes they got very hard opinion. That's not what I do for the founder. I make that very, very clear. I will give advice. The founder, it is their company. And also I get into the head of the founder and I say to the founder, and I might not agree with stuff, the founder might have a very strong view on culture, but that is how they want the culture to be. Do you know what I mean? I don't agree with, there's no one definition of culture. Now we've got all these people in the market at the moment saying we must have this level of X, Y, and Z, or stop doing X and so forth. It's rife on LinkedIn at the moment.
I can't who
gave you the right to tell everybody else how things should be in terms of and don't get me wrong, there's definitely and that's ironic because I've said a lot of advice on this today and that's my opinion, but my point is I don't force my opinion on others. I have opinions. They're strongly, strong opinions loosely held. And I love being challenged on them. And I think most about business is about compromise to be successful. And that's the first thing as a team, or disagree and commit, or whatever we want to say. But yeah, I think that fundamentally comes down to, a founder-led business is exactly that. People have to get comfortable with that. If you're an advisor and a coach or whatever, and I do believe, it's only at some point the mission becomes greater than the founder. But people have to recognize that, often that founder is the brand and the make or break of that company, regardless. And it's a long time and high risk, in my opinion, to exit a founder out. Unless there are real, and I've seen that happen too, which I won't go into, but so that's my point, is like you said, founders, be free, trust your gut, use advisors when you need to trust them. I think someone put on LinkedIn, so this is ironic because I'm quoting LinkedIn now, but someone did put, if you want to get nowhere, like, ask everybody. I think make sure you've got the right sort of circle. But you have to make a decision. So, and you sometimes going to get it right and you're sometimes going to get it wrong. And
it's like I always say, which is basically my personal brand, for lack of a better term, cut the bullshit. There needs to be a lot less bullshit. I think, honest advice, honest feedback is very hard to come by these days because everyone's seems, there's always a reason not to be honest, if you know what I mean. But But look, I'm conscious of the fact that you do have to run, so I will let you go. But I'll put excuse me, my my voice is breaking. I'll put your LinkedIn and your website, everything in the description below. But is there anywhere you wanted to direct people to check anything else out that you're doing?
You're great, by the way. Like best interview so far.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, honestly,
I appreciate it.
I could talk to you more. We should have more conversation. We should do this again.
This is why they're usually 2 hours.
Yeah,
because I do love a good chin wag, So
and you make really good points. You can tell that you're the most invested out of the people who are speaking to on this topic. Really, really good. What do I want? Oh no, just tag the company, a developer in it. Tag me, whatever, get it out there. I tend to
go there and learn about your services and things like that.
That's perfect. And then I'll do the rest of it where I need to put different. I'm going to put different bits on my website eventually, and have a podcast page on my website so people can see different materials. So that I'll finish off the rest on that. So, but thank you very much for your time.
It's been my absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you. Oh, bless you. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Gregory.
Take care.
Bye, Greg. Ciao. Bye.
Thank you for listening and/or watching. Please like and subscribe and join in the conversation in the comments below.